The locked door of the bathhouse hangs on a heavy lock, dried sealing wax on the iron. A map of drainage ditches with arrows indicating the flow and dark marks of flashes pinned to the wall nearby. The pavement reeks of stagnant water. A greasy film shimmers in a narrow gutter. Flies swarm above it. In the square nearby, a clerk slowly enters the latest fines for debauchery into a book, while in the same ditch around the corner, leather waste sticks to the ground. The city pretends to be afraid of the body, closes its doors and buys seals, but leaves the water to flow over the carcasses and dye drains. Here, mortality is not announced at the town hall. It is guessed by the smell. I welcome you and ask you to write in the comments where you are watching from and how your everyday water is arranged, where the storm drains flow, who cleans the gutters, whether there are covers on the wells. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience. What follows is a dry chronicle of how morality replaces sewage systems and how the adult population pays for it. I am talking about the year when the council closed public baths until morals were corrected, introduced night raids for decency, and expanded the powers of guards at laundries and courtyards. New lines appeared in the accounting books. Salaries for inspectors, the purchase of locks, starch for seals, and the maintenance of cells for violators. On the next page, the column for the deepening of the main cesspool was empty, postponed until a convenient time. Medical notes from the same period looked poor and honest. Streets, wells, slaughterhouses, dye works, funeral dates, where there was a tannery and livestock disease, where leather shavings rotted in the heat and thick slurry oozed, the weeks of burials became more frequent. These lists included only adults, hard labor, hard water, and adult mortality, without embellishment. The first turning point was born not in sermons, but on a map. The arrows of the drains coincided with the chains of graves. Streets with closed manhole covers and private courtyards endured the summer more easily. Narrow alleys, where the gutter ran level with the threshold, became corridors of disease. The myth explained everything as looseness, because it was easy to control. You could forbid it, disperse it, lock it up, and report it. The document spoke differently and more quietly. The bathhouse regulations on the depth of sedimentation tanks, the slope of ditches, the order of water replacement, the flooring over the gutters, the fine for the master for overflowing. There they counted buckets, hours, and people with shovels, not other people's thoughts. The second fork is visible when compared to the neighboring commune, where the baths were not closed. There, strict regulations were introduced. Hours for workshops spread out over several days, mandatory water changes, a ban on nearby shops from dumping slop on bath days, and punishment for the master for an overflowing sedimentation tank. Moral reminders were given, but they did not replace sanitary regulations. Medical records showed that, with a similar population density, mortality during the heat was lower than in the city that chose patrols instead of decking. The bathhouse rules were strict and life-saving. depths in cubits, slopes in fractions. Cleaning schedule by the hour. Not a word about temptations, but a clear order of actions. The third outcome was reflected in the budget. The total amount of seasonal fines for decency was equal to the cost of reinforcing the walls of the main gutter at the intersection of 3 streets and purchasing heavy covers for 2 wells. But the fines brought in revenue and made the authorities visible, while the ditches brought silence and the disappearance of the news. It was politically safer to wave the flag of morality than to argue with the workshops whose drains poisoned their neighbors. Leather workers did not want to transport waste downstream. Dye works resisted restrictions on days and colors, and slaughterhouse owners clung to the water near the wall. Thus, the fight against debauchery became a cover for saving on pipes and boards. I leave 3 stacks of paper on the table: bathhouse regulations, city budgets, doctor's notes. And they argue among themselves more honestly than any speech. The statutes demand depth and slope, the budgets stretch toward locks and guards. The doctors transfer funeral dates to the map and get a pattern of arrows and black dots. Where, at the end of the season, they did find money for flooring and covers, the black marks became less frequent. Where they continued to seek noise and laughter, the dots ran along the bold line of tanning waste. Adults survived not thanks to notations, but thanks to hot water, a cover on the well, and a board over the ditch. This is not a spectacle or a slogan. It is a simple practice that always saves better than a seal on a lock. I continue to walk on paper and water. From the files with statutes, lists of fines, and medical notes, a monotonous route of illness emerges, which can be walked from the slaughterhouse to the laundry, from the dyeing shop to the open ditch, from the ditch to the well without a lid. In the quarter near the market, the city came up with a new luxury that season. A report about a too-cheerful courtyard cost less than 2 cartloads of garbage removal. An entire economy of propriety grew out of this difference. In a single day, the patrol collected several fines and returned to the town hall as victors. In a single day, people with shovels buried their boots in the mud, and their work disappeared in the morning rain, leaving no loud trace. I look at the estimate and see how political taste chooses the visible. The ritual of locking the bathhouse door becomes a theater of power, while the wooden planking over the gutter becomes everyday silence that is not shown in the square. The doctor's notes are persistent. They mention adult laundresses and apprentices whose yards are downstream, where, at the beginning of the season, they laid down flooring and took the manure pile to a vacant lot downwind. The funeral lines were already thinning by the end of summer. Where they skimped on boards, disease crept along the gutter. The dry arithmetic in these notebooks looks like a foreign language to those who write about temptation. But it is precisely this arithmetic that paints a second, more accurate picture of the city. Instead of morality, there is friction. Instead of vice, there is the slope of the ditch. Instead of public temptation, there is the proximity of the tannery drain. I am not romanticizing the bathhouse. It is as much a workshop as a smithy or a dye house. Its charter is an instruction manual for handling hot water, air, and stone. And when it is replaced by a moral poster, the skill of caring for the body as a tool of labor disappears, and in its place comes a penalty box. The myth continues to construct convenient chains of cause and effect, in which laughter at the laundry is turned into the beginning of trouble. The document responds to it with trifles. One old decree mentions covers on wells, heavy on hinges, so that they would not be stolen from the bench and removed for the sake of economy. Another decree concerns the distance from meat shops to the nearest gutter, no less than a few cubits, so that the fat does not have time to solidify in the ditches. A third decree concerns the cleaning of the bathhouse floor, on schedule, not when the mood strikes. These boring regulations do not argue with moralizing. They bypass it like water bypasses a stone. And every time the authorities return the conversation to modesty, they turn away from these points and from people whose work is unpleasant to look at, but beneficial for the lungs. I see a brief experiment emerging, not in the scientific fashion, but out of necessity. In a distant neighborhood, where new houses are getting richer faster than old ones, the elders agree on a simple thing. For 1 month, they keep the bathhouse open, according to strict regulations, monitor the water change, put planks over the ditch, and cover 2 wells with heavy lids. In the budget, this costs the equivalent of 2 weeks of decency patrols. Medical records show that by the middle of the month, the number of funerals stabilizes and stops growing. In the neighboring district, where the previous regime of locks and raids was left in place, the funeral lines continue to stretch on. I am not using lofty words here, simply 2 adjacent stacks of paper, placed side by side, produce 2 different graphs. The first graph resembles a descent to the plain, the second, a path up a scree slope. Religious pressure returns to the agenda, as always, at a time of fear. Preachers warn of weakness. The city increases fines for night gatherings, and laundries double their security guards. This does not turn into detailed descriptions of pain. It looks like a social fact. Adult residents pay with money and fever for the fact that the authorities have chosen visible rituals instead of invisible pipes. During the same period, a note from a master carpenter lands on the town hall desk. He asks to be paid for the flooring not on a one-off basis, but according to the quarterly rate, explaining that the boards are rotting and need to be replaced on dry days. No one quotes his words, but his estimate is closer to the point than any loud prescriptions. If the decking is paid for according to the norm, the rats will be inconvenienced. The water will have somewhere to go, and the workers will have somewhere to dry their boots without sinking into sticky slush. I return to bathhouses as a point where the substitution is particularly clear. They are being closed not because they are more dangerous than ditches, but because it is convenient to hang seals on their doors. The bathhouse regulations include a clause about sedimentation tanks, about changing the water, about washing the floor, and about schedules. And there is a fine for the master for overflowing. Where these points are enforced, the bathhouse functions as a filter and a schedule for cleanliness. Where they are replaced by decency, the city gets the same bodies, the same buckets, and the same dirt, only without control, under the nose of the guard, who finds it easier to watch people than to watch the gutter. The doctor writes that adults cope better when there is hot water, a separate trough for laundry, and order rather than fear. It's an unassuming phrase, but in the cemetery, they believe it. A comparison of estimates gives a third twist, less emotional, but accurate. Over the season, the city collected fines equal to the cost of reinforcing the walls of the main sewer at a key intersection, plus the manufacture of half a dozen heavy covers and the hiring of people with shovels for several weeks. This money went to guards, sealing wax and starch. By the end of the season, we have the discipline of fear, but no reduced water level in the ditch. Fear is transparent. It is cheap in the moment and expensive in terms of graves. Practice, on the contrary, is more expensive at the start and cheaper at the end. I am not making a moral point here. I am simply adding up the columns. Where the authorities have the courage to argue with the workshops, paper suddenly starts to work. Tanners are assigned to take their waste downstream outside the city. Dye works are given specific days for draining, and wooden trap grates are installed. Slaughterhouses are prohibited from cutting near the market wall, and morning blood is taken to places where neighbors do not drink the water. The decision causes muted discontent among the powerful workshops. But after a few weeks, the usual repetitions of street names paired with the word tannery disappear from the funeral books. This is neither a miracle nor divine punishment. It is simply a consequence of the fact that water no longer returns to the jug through the gutter. And at this moment it becomes clear how myth gives way to document, when paper ceases to be just a seal and begins to be a plan of action. I close this chapter of history not with repentance or triumph, but with a working plan that, once put into motion, holds the city together like a shoulder joint holds a hand. It includes baths with regulations, planks with scheduled replacement, hinged covers, ditch slopes, removal of carcasses downstream, shovels that are paid for before the rain, not after the funeral. There is almost no reason for beautiful speeches in it, but the pages with black dots on the map are becoming fewer. And when the next clerk brings a new book of fines for debauchery, this book no longer looks like a source of pride. Against the backdrop of heavy covers and quiet decking, it sounds like the same old attempt to talk about the body instead of dealing with water. I continue to keep two parallel books in view, the paper on decency and the paper on water, and I see how they set different routes for the city. The first demands attention to bodies, to clocks, to doors. The second rests on slopes, floors, lids, and people with shovels. In our season, the city once again chooses the visible. At the beginning of a hot week, more guards appear at intersections, laundries count baskets, and taverns stop adult visitors and check their names against notebooks. On the same days, downstream, a thick film of grease floats on the water like a continuous ribbon, and near the tannery drain, layers of waste that have not been removed in time are visible. I am not making up riddles. When warm water from the courtyards flows into open gutters, along with kitchen waste in the evening, sticky stains spread across surfaces by morning, visible to anyone who cleans their doorstep. Our statistics live on these stains. Where there is a common well without a cover in the courtyards, people line up with buckets. Medical notes carefully note that adults suffering from heat-induced pain in their shoulders and lower back return to this well more often than to the source further away, which is covered with a heavy lid and requires extra steps. And the more often the bucket is lowered into the common well, the more of a shiny film appears on the surface, which is invisible at noon, but clearly visible in the morning light. There is a clause in the statutes that has long been ignored. The lid must be hinged and bolted so that it cannot be sold by the cup at the neighboring bench or taken away under a canopy. This clause is not about morality, but about the discipline of objects. When lids become rare, water becomes a meeting place for all the smells of the neighborhood. I observe another prepared turning point that does not like to be shown: a downpour. Once a season, heavy rain washes away the ridge of garbage from the edges of the gutter and turns the ditch into a raging stream. On that day, the watchful authorities collect fewer fines, people are hiding, and the water pulls down everything that is not held back by the grates. The next morning, in the neighborhoods downstream, new lines appear in the funeral books a week later. This is not a surprise or a punishment. It is the mathematics of slope. Where there was decking over the gutter, and where the grate held back the mud, the splash is softer. Where there was no decking, the gutter became a trough. The downpour is not an enemy in itself, but a test of our infrastructure. And if the city preferred a lock on the bathhouse door to a board over the gutter, the downpour will reveal that choice every time. The political scene in recent months has been simple. Meetings mention restraint, order in the late hours, and gender mixing. It is more difficult to talk about discounts for workshops so that they can transport waste downstream. It is easier to manage the guards than to argue with the workshops. The authorities avoid open conflict with tanners and dyers. They are supported by money, they are known by name, they have access to the elders. On the other hand, street checks bring monotonous and understandable lines to the revenue book. I am not attributing malicious intent. I am recording financial gravity. The fine grows on its own like weeds if it is not paid on time. The cost of the cuvette, on the contrary, requires a decision and a signature. It is in this difference that our season of mortality is hidden. A dry but important line is also drawn along gender lines. The lock on the bathhouse door is considered a concern for women's modesty. At the same time, the bathhouse rules, when they are enforced, protect both women's and men's bodies equally. The schedule, water changes, separate troughs, floor cleaning, and drainage. The document does not flatter anyone's virtue. It saves energy and reduces risk for a craft town where adult women carry baskets and adult men slaughter animals. The myth, however, shifts the conversation to the realm of posturing, where men can talk about honor and women should listen to instruction. It is cheap language for a high price. In funeral books in such years, there are more lines next to the streets of the lowlands, where laundry drains flow into the same gutters as slaughterhouses, and where the closed bathhouse did not give anyone a clean stone to stand on. I return to the small logistics on which windows and lungs depend. Every few days, janitors must remove the top layer from the sediment trap at the bath stove and take it on a cart to a place downstream. The document states this briefly and clearly, and there is a fine for the master if the overflow goes into the street. When the bathhouse is closed, this simple operation disappears along with it. Water from the courtyards begins to carry what was previously filtered in the sedimentation tank directly into the city's network of ditches. The same people who were responsible for the dirty work under the current charter lose their jobs and become unnoticed statistics. Their hands no longer hold back the dirt at the source, and the city receives it at its doorstep. Each such loss is not an abstract moral, but the disappearance of a specific skill. Scoop, carry, close. I look again at the neighboring commune, where regulations keep the bathhouse open. There they criticize excesses, but they do not cancel the schedule. The moral agenda is heard in sermons, and the sanitary agenda is heard in schedules. Medical records note an effect that is difficult to love and easy to verify. Fewer boils on the legs, fewer skin inflammations, fewer fevers among those who use the water change schedule. This is not the kind of victory that is carried out into the square. It has no slogan. But it is precisely this that disrupts the rhythm of the funeral clerk. The paradox is that the order of modesty in the form of a separate hour is given precisely where the order of cleanliness works as an engineering system, not as a moral punishment. In our city, after a downpour and long discussions in the town hall, which did not make it into any of the glossy chronicles, a series of quiet decisions is nevertheless being pushed through. The amount of money that was spent on night raids in the last quarter is allocated for the purchase of boards for flooring. At the main intersection, the slope of the gutter is remeasured with a ruler rather than by eye. Several heavy covers are returned to the wells and secured with hinges so that they cannot be sold for scrap. And almost immediately, without fanfare, the laundries change their rules. On days when the bathhouse is open, draining from nearby benches is prohibited. All this sounds like a summary of boring innovations. But when I look again at the map of funeral marks, I see that the lines stretching along the gutters are interrupted. They do not disappear, but they are interrupted. This is the language of infrastructure. It speaks in fragments of silence. I deliberately record the reverse movements as well, because the myth does not give up. As soon as the stinking season is over, the town hall again increases the fines for night gatherings, again discusses modesty in clothing, and again inflates the number of guards. Pipes and flooring immediately end up on the can be postponed until next spring list. At this point, it becomes clear that the victory of paper over myth is not a one-time thing. It requires repetition, like any cleaning. And this is the main thing that an adult choice entails. You need to think about water, not when there is an alarm, but on a schedule. Medical notebooks, in which each month has its own page, best demonstrate the value of regularity. Where there is a schedule, the schedule of death is broken. I bring this part to another important, albeit inconspicuous conflict between a pious view of the body and the everyday courage to clean up around the drain. The first system provides comfort because all its actions can be listed in a square: locks, seals, guards, fines. The second system comforts no one because its actions are invisible: covers, shovels, boards, slopes. But only the second system can reduce the smell and keep an adult alive. This is the political truth of a communal city. Respect for the body is expressed not by preaching, but by paying those who work with dirt. To leave no doubt, I again combine 3 bundles of paper: statutes, estimates, and medical notes. The statutes approve the slope and water change. The estimates either pay for people with shovels or for guards, and the notebooks record the outcome. When the city gives money to the guardians of decency, funeral lines follow the arrows of the current. When the city pays for boards and covers, the lines are interrupted. There is nothing to embellish here, nothing to quote, only the result. And if someone needs a slogan, it will not be a sound, but a smell, disappearing where the flowing water ceases to meet the carrion on its way to your jug. I continue to piece together a map of causes from scattered sheets, where each street is checked not by a slogan, but by water. In the middle of the season, a new fashion for air purification appears in the town hall files. Fragrant herbs and incense are purchased for large halls where townspeople gather for edifying readings. This provides a ritual that is convenient to showcase, and in no report does it conflict with the interests of the workshops. At the same time, the expense lists again contain no mention of strengthening the walls of the main gutter or removing the carcasses downstream. Medical notes from these weeks record a slight but persistent shift. Fewer complaints where the floors cover the cesspools, more where the gutter is open, and where in the morning there is a greasy stain on the water from the bench. The aroma in the square does not change the flow under the floors. It only masks the smell that betrays the city's lies. Meanwhile, adult everyday life continues its cycle. Laundries pressed up against the ditches, pour water into the same place where die-wers dump their waste. Slaughterhouses, saving on carts, leave what they used to call nobodies near the gutters. I see how at one intersection, where last year there were still boards, they were removed to make way for a temporary landing place for carts and not returned. A few weeks later, a string of lines with the same name of the alley appears in the funeral book. This is not poetry or karma. It is accounting for deviation. And when they talk again at the meeting about order at a late hour, this order concerns doors and hips, not what flows at the threshold. The notes of one doctor reveal a quiet but important scene. A master with a cart, an adult, strong, accustomed to plowing, scrapes the sediment from the morning, where the bathhouse continues to operate according to regulations, and carries this dirt downstream to a specially dug ravine. During that season, the funeral lines on this branch of the gutters thin out faster. There is no morality there. There is only labor. When the bathhouse closes, this man loses his dirty but salvific job, and his rag and shovel cease to be part of the city's immune system. The city does not lose its decency. The city loses a filter, invisible and irreplaceable. Another layer of conflict is revealed, accounting, which people don't like to discuss in public. Accountants neatly add up fines for debauchery and sometimes leave notes in the margins about private donations for replacing locks, renewing seals, and rewarding watchmen. The same pages know the price of boards and covers, but record them as expenses requiring approval. This word turns into a pause that costs lives. It is easier to coordinate guards than to anger tanners or dyers whose funds feed the city market. It is more convenient for the authorities to touch on human posture than to touch someone's edge of profit at the trough. Medical notebooks stubbornly continue the method of comparison. Where the street slopes down to the river and where the gutters cover the ditch, there are fewer repetitions of names in the funeral book. Where there is a well without a cover, where it is convenient to lower buckets 10 times a day, the dates of burials are more frequent. Where the grates worked as traps after a downpour, the surge is shorter. Where there were no grates, the gutter becomes a conveyor of disaster. These pages do not promise miracles. They draw a direct connection between objects and outcomes. And the more boring the objects, a board, a loop, a cover, a slope, the more reliable the outcome. Meanwhile, the myth flows into new formulas. After a particularly difficult week, the town hall increases penalties for night gatherings, increases the number of guards at laundries, and introduces crowd density checks in courtyards. The familiar word modesty is replaced by addresses and slopes. But there in the file lies a note from a barber, a man with hard-working hands and no beautiful syllables. He lists 24 adult names and 3 streets where these people lived. He compares rainy days and funeral days. He asks that the bathhouse be kept open according to a strict schedule, and that 2 wells be covered with heavy lids, because these lids cannot be taken away to be sold. This request has no formal wording, but it has an address and an action. And it is precisely these things, after going through addition and subtraction, that change the picture on the funeral map. An initiative group appears, not of righteous people, but of craftsmen, who are tired of breathing sour air in the mornings. They do not argue about morals. They agree on work. Every few days, 2 people with shovels walk along the ditch, remove the greasy layer, and put it in a barrel. Others carry boards and repair rotten flooring, and still others mark where the covers on the wells have loosened. Their small, thankless work has a noticeable impact on the number of funerals in their neighborhood. These statistics don't last long, because without city funding and a regular schedule, the cooperative quickly runs out of steam. But even this brief respite confirms how the movement of ill-fated private items, boards, covers, grates, can change the outcome when the budget lacks courage. Religious pressure eases over time, where results are visible. Preachers begin to insert phrases about caring for the cleanliness of the home and the work of those who clean up filth into their speeches, and although this is still the language of feelings, I see traces of documents in it. The statutes of bathhouses and regulations on flooring have quietly crept into the sermon. This is not a transformation of the pulpit into an engineering office, but it is an important shift. Where prestigious speech ceases to shame the body and begins to defend labor, the city takes a step toward the real protection of its adult residents. Those who carry water, clean the cesspool, and carry carrion farther than the market is accustomed to. In a neighboring commune, where the regulations have not been interrupted, another boring thing is added at the end of the season: street records with notes about rainstorms. They are not shy about pettiness and are not afraid of routine. Medical notebooks are stacked there with craftsmen's plans. And from this marriage of arithmetic and craftsmanship, a clear rule emerges. Before an expected downpour, intensify the cleaning of grates and sediment traps. After the downpour, clean the gutters 2 blocks downstream. Each time this costs money, and each time it does not bring moral fines to the cash register, but it does bring breaks in the chain of funerals. By that time, the word regulations ceases to sound like a punishment and begins to sound like a habit. Our city is moving towards this slowly and reluctantly, but it is moving. After several particularly foul-smelling weeks, the line item for decking and covers is returned to the budget. The money is small, but the effect on the map is noticeable. In the lower neighborhoods, where black spots used to be continuous, gaps appear between them. The people in green raincoats haven't disappeared, but their roots are becoming less important than those of the people with shovels. This is a clear substitution of symbols. The sign of severity is giving way to the sign of care. Not abstract, not benevolent, but practical care about where the water will go and where the dirt will stop. Here, a new, deep conflict arises between the desire of the authorities to control bodies and the duty to control objects. The former is easier and gives instant returns in the form of coins and applause. The latter is slower, more expensive at the start, and requires arguing with powerful workshops. But only the latter changes the outcome. The bathhouse charter turns out to be not a weakness, but a contract between the city and living adults. The city provides hot water, stone, flooring, decking, a cover, and a slope, and in return receives stability during the hot season. When this contract is broken, bathhouse locks, seals, and guards appear. But instead of stability, the city gets a beautiful pose and an inevitable smell. I return again to myth and paper, because this duo defines the entire season. Myth judges by appearance, mixing of the sexes, laughter, late hours. Paper judges by things, the roof of the well on a hinge, the grate over the cesspool, the depth of the sedimentation tank, the schedule for changing the water and washing the floor, the removal of waste downstream. Where paper formalizes things, myth loses ground. Where paper is turned into a seal on a lock, myth flourishes. And in this, without unnecessary pathos, lies the most sober truth of urban survival. An honest estimate with a board and a lid is more reliable than the clamor of guards. The end of the season brings a test of habit. The rains go away, the heat subsides, and the Treasury looks for ways to save money. At this very moment, the city must not forget the lesson it learned the hard way. If there is room in the budget for flooring, covers, and slopes, if the bathhouse regulations continue to exist as instructions rather than as a cover for locks, the next hot week will be quieter. Then the practice of cleanliness will become routine, and the ritual of propriety will be a supplement, not a substitute. Then adults will return from the market across the street, where there is no stench, and the funeral book will finally resemble a calendar, not a march of arrows on a map of drains. In winter, when the water freezes and the smells hide in the ice crusts, the city finally sits down at the long table of lists and norms. I see how the statutes of bathhouses are rewritten, how a modest line about the planned replacement of flooring appears in the estimate next to the guards, how the tedious question of the slopes of the gutters at the narrowest turns arises in the order of the day. Doctors bring thin notebooks with knitted spines to the town hall. They contain notes on the streets, on rainy days, on the wind by the river, on the neighborhood with tanneries and dye works. This is not moralism, but geography. These notebooks are placed on top of the book of fines, and for the first time this season, the paper about water lies above the paper about decency. This is not a gesture or a demonstration of virtue. It is the order of the tabletop, which often predicts the order of the streets. The new year begins with tiny, almost invisible changes. Heavy manhole covers are fitted with hinges that cannot be pried open with a knife to steal them for sale. Bathhouses still have separate hours in the schedule, but now the schedule is accompanied by technical requirements, regulated water changes, strict floor cleaning cycles, fines for workers who spill water into the gutter, and mandatory removal of sediment downstream on certain days. Laundry workers sitting by the gutters are given brief instructions on drainage during bath hours. Not a novel about modesty, but a water movement regime. Tanneries are assigned a friendly but demanding schedule for removing waste, and dye works are given grates and a table of colors that cannot be poured out on the same days. All this does not seem like a great moral turnaround. But on the funeral map, after a few weeks, gaps appear between the black dots, as if someone were wiping a fogged-up window. The myth still tries to resist, bringing the conversation back to the physical posture. The city leaflets echo the familiar words of restraint and silence, but woven into them is something else. Reminders to take care of your home and to respect the work of those who clean up waste. The rhetoric cautiously bows to craftsmanship. I am not making an ode to virtue out of this. I am simply noting that where the paper begins to describe objects, speech ceases to intimidate and learns to give thanks. This small ethical shift is reinforced by harsh practice. Fines for mixing genders no longer feed the main cash register. They are being replaced by a separate fee for workshops that violate sanitary standards. Where a workshop violates the drainage schedule or disposes of waste closer than required, it is not the visitor or the shopkeeper who pays, but the one who is listed as the source of the waste. For the first time, views are matched with addresses. I compare the neighbors again. In the commune where the bathhouse operated according to the charter throughout the previous season, this year they are reducing guard hours and instead hiring people with shovels on a permanent basis, rather than as casual part-time workers. The doctor's notebooks there noted not a miracle, but stability. The waves of illness have become shorter and lower. Our city is trying to catch up, and it is only halfway there. The budget still remembers the convenience of fines for debauchery, but has already learned to buy boards and hinges in advance so as not to have to urgently replenish supplies in the spring. The black dots on the map are mobile, but they surrender where they are challenged by wood and metal. It is not a spectacular battle. There is no dramatic tolling of bells, but there is silence at dawn, when the ditch under the floor does not smell. Among the papers that usually draw the eye away, there is one that is long-term, heavy, like a wet rope, the rain register. It is not an atmospheric chronicle, but urban technology. It records when the grates were cleaned before the rain, where the top layer of the sediment traps was removed, and which sections of the ditches required early replacement of the decking. With the first heavy downpour of the year, the register works like a battle map. Water goes where it is allowed to go. What should have been trapped is trapped. In the funeral book, the spike is lower than expected, and no one mentions this number in public. It is simply seen in a long line of numbers written in full. And that's fine. Practices that don't need fanfare rarely need excuses. Conflict with the workshops proves inevitable, and it is this conflict that reveals the human cost of reform. Leather workers lose some of their convenience, dye works change the logic of their working days, and slaughterhouses move their cutting operations further away from the market. These are not pleasant changes. They affect money and habits. In response, there is a risk of short strikes and quiet sabotage. The city senses danger because these people feed the town hall with rich taxes. But this is where the most important choice comes in: to continue playing with symbols on doors or to engage in a dispute with the powerful. This time, the council chooses the latter, not out of holiness, but out of simple calculation on the funeral card. And as soon as the first precedent appears, when the workshop pays for the broken grate and the disrupted drainage schedule, the myth of looseness loses some of its power. It becomes cheaper than money, because it ceases to explain what the pipe is responsible for. I see the flip side, the fate of adults whose work has always been invisible. People who emptied cesspools, corrected slopes, and hammered additional bars under the decking suddenly receive not charity, but a place in the budget. Their work is no longer called upon as needed. It is planned. These plans have a rhythm, like a prayer, but they pray not to words, but to wood and water. And where the work schedule coincides with the rain schedule, the habit of medical notebooks filling up in the same weeks disappears. Death gives way to routine. It sounds dry and harsh, but it is more honest for a city that wants to breathe. I do not forget the dark days, because they return. There are weeks when it is hotter than usual, when more livestock is brought in than planned, when more fatty fish is sold at the market, and by evening, the gutters rustle like fabric underwater. On such days, the guards again seem like an attractive solution. They are visible, they are quick. But experience has already taught me to record hands, not faces. And when, instead of raiding the courtyards, doctors, carpenters, and janitors go to key sections of the gutters, close the covers, clean the grates, and put up extra boards, the spike on the funeral map flares up and immediately fades away. The myth recedes because the mood of the square, whatever it may be, cannot carry a bucket to your well. Only an adult with shoulders accustomed to weight can carry it. It remains to say the main thing without moral sugar syrup. The city, which for months financed decency, bought stamps, and practiced counting baskets at laundries, acquired the expensive habit of looking at bodies instead of looking into the ditch. The city, which decided to give money to boards, covers, sedimentation tanks, and people with shovels, got fewer reasons for sermons and fewer lines from the funeral clerk. The ending is not heroic. It smells of wood, hot water, and wet clay. Cleanliness practices reduce mortality, while prohibitions only cause noise. And if this conclusion sounds too simple, it is because it is simple. Paper defeats myth when it describes objects and pays for hands, not when it puts a lock on the bathhouse door.